shamanism is a tradition, is the oldest healing and spiritual transformational tradition on the planet, going back to Stone Age, Paleolithic times when we were hunter-gatherers. And the way I've come to understand it in present time, following the work of anthropologists like Michael Harner and others, who talk about a shamanic state of consciousness. The shamanic journey is an indigenous metaphor for what we would call in psychology an altered state of consciousness. And the shamanic, so the essence of shamanism, to my mind, is the intentional use of altered states of consciousness called shamanic journeys for the purposes of healing and obtaining knowledge or divination. And the methods that shamans use to enter into that altered state of consciousness, the triggers or the catalysts that they use to propel themselves into that, on that journey, there's a wide variety of methods, but the two most common ones, the two most widely used ones are the use of psychoactive plants or plant extracts and herbs, such as ayahuasca in South America or peyote in Mexico and North America, or various other ones, which have become known to psychology and psychiatry as psychedelic drugs or psychoactive drugs and substances, but have this long shamanic tradition of being used in that way. And the other widespread method is rhythmic drumming, rhythmic repetitive drumming, where the beat of the drum serves as a kind of, it's not musical, it doesn't vary the rhythms, it's just a repetitive beat, and people talk about the entrainment of heart rate and brain rhythms through the rhythmic beat to move them into an altered state of consciousness. The shamans themselves, the shamanic traditions themselves might say something like, the drum is the horse which I use to go on the shamanic journey. So the shamanic practitioner would typically use, start with a drum beat, and then at a certain point they would lie down and hand the drum to their assistant, who would continue beating the drum while the practitioner goes on an inner journey for the purpose of obtaining healing knowledge, which he can then bring back. So divination then literally means obtaining knowledge from the divine world, and the divine world is a classical kind of medieval term for what in indigenous societies or shamanistic societies they might call the spirit world, the world of spirits. Shamanic worldview, the worldview of shamanistic cultures, indigenous cultures, the oldest cultures in the world, and some still exist to this day, is an animistic worldview where everything in nature is animated by living intelligences that they call spirit. That it means trees and rocks and rivers and forests and plants of all kinds, animals of all kinds, human beings, of course. And these spirits can be contacted, and communication can exist between them. And we have that notion, that idea, that we can be in touch with the spirit world, which also includes the world of the dead. In other words, our own ancestors. So shamanic practices are done with the assistance of the spirits of animals and plants. For example, when they use psychoactive plants to go on a journey, they actually, to do the healing, they work with the spirit of that plant, not so much the biological herb, although that is also then used. So divination means obtaining knowledge then by going into an altered state, like a shamanic kind of state, and obtaining knowledge that way from the spirit world or the divine world, or it's also called the other world. It's not so much an altered state, it's another condition of reality. So that in an altered state you can contact that. And there's various ways, and people talk about entryways into the other world, and they talk about communication between the other worlds. And for example, in dreams we might visit this other world. And there are all kinds of myths and legends about human beings communicating with beings, spirit beings in these other worlds. One of the key differences, as I've come to understand it, between people who live with a shamanistic, animistic worldview and people like ourselves in a modern worldview is that the indigenous shamanistic, animistic worldview says that there are many levels of reality, many worlds, that we exist in many worlds simultaneously. Not just this one world that we have come to call the real world. And that we can have access to these other worlds in special states and through special practices. And that it's a good thing to do that because these other worlds exist whether we recognize them or not. And we are participating in them. We exist in these other worlds as well because we are multidimensional beings as well as the world being multidimensional. So when people talk about, in esoteric traditions, for example, about the astral body, it's not just like we have an astral body, but the whole world has an astral body. There's an astral world in which the astral body is our body for moving around and living in that world, just like the physical body is the body for moving around in the physical time-space world. And the other main thing I think that would be important to emphasize about shamanic worldview is that when they talk about spirits, I'm a psychologist, and psychologists deal a lot with people's inner experiences. And but in our worldview, that as psychologists we also accept, spirits are not considered real. At best, say you might be a Jungian, you might say, well, it's a symbol or an archetypal symbol. Now, what's a symbol? A symbol is sort of exists inside of you. It's part of the collective unconscious. So, in other words, it's psychological. And Jung did, incredible, powerful, and important work in getting the scientific establishment of his time to accept the reality of psychic experience and psychological experience. On the other hand, from a shamanic point of view, treating spirits that you encounter as psychological realities is a mistake, is a misconception. They have their own reality, quite independent of human reality. Of course, if you're talking about your human ancestors, then they're human ancestors. But if you're talking about the spirits of rocks and trees and animals, landscapes, whole landscapes, sky beings or earth beings, you're not talking about human psychological symbols or archetypes or anything, really. We human beings are not the only beings on the planet, is what these traditions tell us. And this is why in my work I work as a consciousness researcher, but I also study the area of eco-psychology or green psychology, where these kinds of conceptions tie in then to modern evolving conceptions, postmodern evolving conceptions of ourselves as living in a world of interconnectedness and interconnected relations with the natural world and the non-human world. That we're, as you know, in the process of destroying and disrupting, which can then be seen as a psychological problem because it's psychological beings, us, ourselves, who are doing it, not somebody else. So that's shamanism and divination. So now a word about visionary experience, and I'll talk about experience first. Here's a definition of experience from William James, one of my favorite psychologists and heroes, philosophical heroes, whose writings over 100 years ago are still ahead of the time as far as current psychological thinking is concerned. He said this: "My experience is what I choose to attend to." My experience is what I choose to attend to. And so I thought, well, this points to the importance of attention. And I thought, this is pretty interesting. But what about, then I started to think about, what if I'm having an experience that I don't like and I did not choose, like I'm in jail, or I'm being tortured, or in pain in some way. Didn't choose that experience, wouldn't choose it, not voluntary. But notice what he says. He says, my experience is what I choose to attend to. What do we do when we're experiencing trauma or shock or extreme pain? We dissociate. In other words, we don't attend, we attend to something else. We switch our attention to another space in consciousness, another vision or interior, someplace else. It's called dissociation. So, the notion of attending, and attention is always selective. And in my talk on Saturday, I don't know how many of you were there, but I pointed to the importance and an interesting, important relationship between intention and attention. And I invite you to think about that for a moment, and this will tie in directly to the experiential part that we're going to do. Because you can think of it this way. Intention is a selective process by means of which you select what it is that you're going to attend to. And that's why when you enter into any altered state of consciousness, we still say, the set and the setting are important. The set is the intention. Or you could also say the question, the issue. And this is in a way obvious when you think about it, but it's important to realize it because it's true of any experience that we're having. You see, you now, you came here with a certain set and intention, expecting to listen to me talking and learn something about what I'm going to talk about, what I'm talking about. And that's your set, and therefore you're attending to me, and that's what's making up your experience. Now, potentially your experience could include a lot of other things. You could, for example, choose to become aware of what's going on behind you, or in the next room, or outside in the garden, or and the same with me. I have a certain intention that brought me to this place. So when you're talking about set and setting, internal and talk about the internal and the external always determines what your experience is. So when you go to a psychotherapist or a doctor or a healer or a psychic or a shaman, you're going to have a certain intention. That might be the problem you want to work on, the pain you have, or the difficulty you're having with somebody, or some missing knowledge that you need that is disturbing you. And that then enables you to select out where you're going, because and so the intention is like an arrow that you could also say interest, that mobilizes your attentional focus in the direction where you want to go. So, for example, when you're doing a healing regression or a regression into the past, as we're going to do in a little bit, then you would use your intention to focus where you're going to go. Like, I want to look at what happened to me at the age of 6 when in this particular situation I nearly drowned or whatever. And so your intention is then to kind of come to terms with that experience. This is a classic way that therapy and healing takes place. Actually, it's the same in healing.